The wind howled across the empty fields like a starving wolf. It clawed at the shutters, whistled through the thatched rooftops, and curled under doorframes, searching for any crack to slip inside. Outside, the sky was an endless stretch of gray, heavy with snow that had fallen for 3 days straight. Everything looked frozen, even time itself. The village of Eldom sat still, buried beneath layers of frost and silence, as if holding its breath against the worst of winter. But inside one small cottage on the edge of the woods, a flickering fire struggled to stay alive, and beside it, huddled beneath patched wool blankets, were the people who refused to let it go out. The coldest nights in medieval Europe weren't just hard, they were deadly. For the peasants of Eldom, survival wasn't guaranteed. They had no central heating, no electric lights, no warm water or sturdy insulation. What they had was each other, old stories passed down by candlelight, a few clever tricks, and a lot of hope. It was in this fragile balance of hardship and resilience that life continued, one cold night at a time. Tomas, the eldest in the cottage, was only 34 but looked older. His hands were cracked and thick from years of tilling frozen earth and chopping wood. He sat closest to the fire, not out of selfishness, but because he was the one to rise at dawn and gather kindling again. His wife, Beta, rubbed their baby's feet to keep them warm. Her breath made little clouds in the air. Their eldest daughter, Mira, only 12, tried to stay awake, even though her eyelids drooped. She liked to listen when Tomas told stories that made the freezing dark seem a little smaller. Once, he said softly, a village like ours had no firewood left, not even a twig. Mira leaned in. The wind outside rattled the door, and for a moment, everyone in the room went quiet, listening. But the people didn't give up. They gathered dried moss, old straw, even animal dung. They burned what they had, not because it burned well, but because it burned it all. The others listened quietly, not because the story was new. It wasn't, but because it reminded them that someone had survived worse. Across the village, other homes were doing much the same. In every hut, cottage, and lean-to, families like Tomas's were wrapped in layers of wool, fur, and whatever warmth they could scavenge. They stuffed straw between their clothes and drank thin cabbage soup to keep their bellies warm. Some burned peat from the bogs, which stank and smoked, but gave off enough heat to matter. Others kept animals indoors, not just for warmth but for company, too. Goats, pigs, even chickens, anything with body heat was welcome like a guest. In those days, winter wasn't a season, it was a test. And every year, it asked the same question: who among you is strong enough to last? The roads to nearby towns were buried in snow. No carts moved. No traders came. Food couldn't be grown, and hunting was a dangerous gamble. Sometimes, the only meat in the pot was from last summer's dried fish or smoked rabbit. If they had any left at all, hunger sat beside cold like a cruel friend. Children whimpered in their sleep, and older folks whispered prayers. When it was too dark to hope, they sang slow, quiet songs in voices worn by smoke and frost. And yet they survived. They knew tricks passed down for generations. Onion skins were stuffed in boots to keep toes dry. Stones were warmed in the fire and tucked under blankets. Wet clothes were dried with body heat. Everything had a use, and nothing was wasted. In this world, ingenuity wasn't clever, it was necessary. Without it, they'd freeze by morning. In the manor house, warm behind its thick stone walls, the local lord and his household waited out the storm in comfort. Fires burned in every hearth, and food, though still plain, was more plentiful. But even there, life was not without fear. Roofs collapsed under snow, illness spread in the cold, and servants whispered about wolves roaming too close. The class divide was wide, but the cold made everyone equal eventually. Myra's younger brother, Jack, woke with a cough. Beta wrapped him tighter in wool and gave him a sip of heated milk, thin and stretched with water. "Just breathe slow," she whispered. But Mira watched the fire instead. She had seen it almost die once, and she never forgot the fear in her father's eyes. Fire was life. Lose it, and the dark claimed everything. The village priest, Father Elric, had called the cold god silence, a time to be still and listen. But Mira wasn't so sure. She thought the cold sounded more like an old woman breathing down your neck, just waiting for you to stop moving. Sometimes, the cold took people in their sleep. They would drift off, too tired to shiver anymore, and not wake up. That's why Betta checked the children often. That's why Tomas made one last round outside each night, no matter how bitter the air. That night, as Tomas opened the door to check the wind, he noticed something strange. There were tracks in the snow. Not animal tracks, and not theirs. Human footprints, too small for a man, but too wide for a child. They led toward the woods, but stopped suddenly, as if the person had simply vanished. He stared for a long time before shutting the door. Back inside, he said nothing. The children were already scared. No need to add mystery to misery. But the look in his eyes stayed with Betta long after he returned to the fire. The fire cracked. Jack coughed again. Mira stared into the flames. Outside, the wind rose louder. Far across the village, near the old well no one used anymore, something moved. Something that shouldn't have been out there. Something that left no steam on the air. But no one saw it. Not yet. And the fire still burned. They didn't know it yet, but the coldest night of the year was just beginning, and something far stranger than snow was coming with it. The fire gave off a low, rhythmic pop as a pocket of sap burst inside the log. Mira watched the tiny sparks dance upward, disappearing into the chimney like lost stars. She tucked her hands under her legs to keep them warm and leaned slightly closer. Outside, the wind had begun to carry with it a sharp whistling sound, not unlike someone's breath catching in a gasp. It might have just been the trees swaying, but it didn't feel like that. Tomas said nothing about the footprints. He sat back down beside the hearth and ran a hand through his beard, more from nerves than need. Betta glanced at him. She knew him well enough to recognize when he was hiding something. She didn't ask, though. Not yet. Not in front of the children. Hours passed like slow syrup. Mira dozed off sitting up. Jack clung to his mother's side, sniffling softly. Even Betta let her eyes close for a while, trusting the warmth of the fire and Tomas's quiet watchfulness. But sleep in these winters was always fragile. It came in short waves and left behind longer stretches of staring into the dark, listening for the wind to change. Elsewhere in the village, not everyone had such company. Old Marjorie, who had outlived both her sons and husband, now lived alone in a shack behind the smokehouse. No one visited her unless they needed herbs or bone charms, and tonight her chimney was dark. No fire, no light. She had run out of wood the day before, but pride had kept her from asking. She believed her thick wool coat would hold out one more night. She believed wrong. At dawn, a neighbor would find her in her chair, eyes open, body frozen stiff. But that hadn't happened yet. In the main square of Eldom, under a sagging wooden sign that marked the bakery, two families now shared one room. The children were piled together on pallets stuffed with straw and spare cloth. A pot of turnip soup sat steaming in the center of the floor, giving off more heat than taste. No one complained, though. Not anymore. Complaints didn't make the cold less cruel. Instead, they whispered stories. One tale, repeated every winter, was about the Frostman, a pale figure who roamed the countryside in the coldest weeks, collecting lost souls for his frozen kingdom. If he tapped your window, it meant you wouldn't live to see the thaw. Some children believed it. Some laughed. But every year, at least one person would swear they heard the knock. Back in Tomas's home, the fire dimmed again. He poked it gently, stirring the coals. Mira stirred awake, rubbing her eyes. "Why doesn't the snow stop?" she whispered. "It will," Tomas said. "Always does. The snow tires, too." Mira didn't laugh, but she smiled, just barely. Betta finally asked the question she'd been holding in. "What did you see outside?" Tomas paused. He didn't want to frighten her, but lying felt worse. "Footprints," he said, leading toward the woods. Betta furrowed her brow. "A traveler. Not in this cold. No horse. No supplies." And the prince just stopped. He didn't say the rest. How they were the shape of boots, but wider, flatter, like someone dragging their feet. Or how they didn't fill with snow like they should have in this weather. Betta looked at the door, then back to Tomas. "You think it was real?" "I don't know," he said honestly. but I don't like it. In the middle of the village, the chapel bell rang once. Just once. No wind could have rung it. It took real weight to move that clapper. It had been silent for weeks. People noticed. Doors opened. Faces peeked out. No one was seen near the chapel. No light, no tracks in the snow. Just the bell, swinging gently in the windless dark. Father Elric had gone to bed early that night, claiming he felt a heaviness in his bones. His tiny room above the chapel smelled of candle wax and dried lavender, meant to ward off the chill and the spirits he believed drifted too near in the dark months. But when the bell rang, he didn't stir, not even once. A group of boys dared each other to run up to the chapel and look inside. They didn't. No one did. The fear was too old, too heavy. Somewhere far behind the village, a long, low howl broke through the forest. At first, it seemed like a wolf. But wolves didn't howl like that. This was longer. Almost human. Almost. Jack stirred, his small body twitching. Betta pulled him tighter and hummed a lullaby under her breath. The song was older than the village. Mira knew the words too, though she rarely sang them. They were only sung in the worst cold. Asterisk, sleep, child, sleep. The fire will keep. The snow may whisper, but don't you weep, asterisk. Tomas listened in silence. He wished he could believe that the fire was enough, that the old songs still held power. But something gnawed at the back of his mind, the footprints, the bell, the howl. And now, as the wind dipped again, he felt the unmistakable sense of being watched. Not by something close, but something far away. Watching through the trees, perhaps. Or through time. Betta, he said quietly, tomorrow we'll go see old Marjorie. She might know what this means. Betta didn't answer. She just nodded. The night dragged on. Hours passed. The snow lightened just a little, but it didn't stop. The fire needed more wood. Mira volunteered. She pulled her shawl over her shoulders and reached for the heavy fur Tomas kept by the door. It was risky, but their woodpile was just outside. Be quick, Betta said. No dawdling. Mira opened the door and stepped into the white. The wind slapped her cheeks. Her breath fogged instantly. She kept her head down, feet crunching through powder. Just 12 steps to the pile. She reached it, grabbed what she could, turned back, and froze. There were more footprints now. Not hers, not Tomas's. Fresh ones, leading to their door. And they were still warm. Not icy, not snow-covered. Mira looked up. No one there. But something had been, and had followed them home. Myra's heart thumped hard in her chest. The log she had gathered slipped from her arms and fell soundlessly into the snow. The footprints, those wide, dragging shapes, were spaced strangely, not like someone walking normally. Each step was off balance, as though whoever or whatever had made them was limping or didn't know how to walk quite right. She took a cautious step back toward the house, eyes fixed on the trail of prints. They led directly up to the door, the same door she had just come out of. She hadn't noticed them then, and she was sure they hadn't been there earlier in the night when Tomas had stepped out. That meant someone had come since. But who? Or what? Her breath came out in short bursts now. Every sound seemed louder. The wind brushing against the trees. The creak of the woodpile. The groan of the roof under too much snow. She felt as though the entire forest were leaning in to listen. She gathered the firewood again, faster this time, not bothering to stack it properly. She just needed to get back inside. But before she could turn fully toward the door, she noticed something even stranger. The prints, they stopped. Right behind her. There were no exit tracks. No return path. No circling back. Just a single trail from the woods to her door. Then nothing. Like something had arrived and never left. Mira didn't scream. She didn't run. She simply backed away, step by step, the logs pressed tightly to her chest, until she reached the threshold of the door. Her hand fumbled for the latch. Inside, Tomas had already stood up. Something in the air had shifted. A pressure. A weight. He flung open the door just as Mira stumbled inside. "Papa," she whispered. "There's something out there." Tomas slammed the door shut and dropped the latch. He helped Mira with the firewood, but his eyes were already searching the floor, looking for footprints, snow, signs of something that had followed her inside. There was nothing. "What did you see?" he asked. "Footprints," she said. "New ones." They stopped just behind me. I didn't hear anything. I didn't see anything, but they were fresh. Betta stood now too, one hand clutching Jack to her hip. Her eyes darted between her daughter and her husband. She didn't need more detail. The fear in Myra's voice was enough. I want everyone to stay near the fire, Tomas said. All night. No one opens that door again. He added more wood to the flames, the dry logs crackling loudly in protest as the fire consumed them. The warmth spread quickly, but none of it felt comforting anymore. Betta sat down beside Mira and held her close. Myra's fingers were icy, her lips pale. But it wasn't just the cold that had shaken her. It was the sense that something ancient had stirred in the dark, something that didn't belong. The rest of the night crawled by. Outside, the wind rose again. Not in gusts, but in strange, rhythmic surges like breathing. Not human breathing, but something deeper. Hollow. Slow. Inside the village, other families began noticing odd things, too. A door left ajar that had been bolted. A pile of snow in the shape of a handprint against a wall. The faint sound of whispering when no one was speaking. And in one home, a small wooden cross fell off the wall without being touched, landing perfectly upright in the snow beneath the window. By morning, the snow had finally stopped. The sky was a pale, glowing gray, as if the sun were trying to remember how to rise. Tomas and Mira were the first outside. They scanned the yard carefully, looking for more prints, signs of movement, anything unusual. The old ones had faded slightly, but were still visible. The air smelled clean and sharp. Almost too clean, like the world had been scrubbed overnight. I want to check on Marjorie, Tomas said. Stay with your mother. But Mira followed him anyway. She didn't want to be alone, and deep down, she sensed her father didn't want to be either. The snow was knee-deep in places, heavy and crusted with ice. They passed the old well near the chapel, still half buried. The chapel bell was still swinging faintly. No one had touched it. When they reached Marjorie's home, Tomas knocked. No answer. He knocked again, louder. Still nothing. With a quick breath, he pushed the door open. Inside, it was quiet. Too quiet. Marjorie sat in her chair by the cold hearth, wrapped in her heavy wool coat. Her eyes were open, staring at nothing. Her skin had gone the color of old milk. She's gone, Tomas said softly. Mira stood beside him silent. Then something caught her eye, a bundle of dried herbs clutched in Marjorie's hand. Lavender, elderflower, and something else she didn't recognize. It smelled strong, earthy, bitter, like tree bark and iron. What's that? She asked. Tomas leaned closer. I don't know, but she held on to it like it mattered. On the table nearby, Marjorie had left a note, written in scratchy, crooked letters on a piece of worn parchment. Asterisk, if the footprints return, burn the oak ash with lavender. Do not follow them. Do not answer knocks after dark. Asterisk. Mira read the words aloud. Tomas said nothing for a long moment. We need to tell the others, he finally said. Back in the village, the air felt still. Too still. The kind of stillness that made people whisper and avoid each other's eyes. Word of Marjorie's death spread quickly. And though the villagers had seen death before, many winters had taken the old and weak, this felt different. The signs, the stories, the footprints. Father Elric, usually a source of comfort, was nowhere to be found. By midday, Tomas called a meeting near the chapel. Most of the villagers gathered, bundled in layers, faces pale and worried. Betta stood with Mira and Jack near the front. Tomas spoke plainly. There's something happening this winter that none of us can explain. The snow, the prince, the bell, and now Marjorie. She left a warning. She believed something was out there. Maybe old stories. Maybe not. But we can't ignore it. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Some scoffed. Others nodded. One man, Alda the blacksmith, spoke up. You want us to burn herbs and hide in our homes like children? It's winter, Tomas. Things happen. Then explain the footprints, Tomas said. Alder had no answer. We'll take shifts watching the woods, Tomas continued. We'll keep the fires burning all night. No one goes outside after sunset. And if you hear knocking, don't answer. No matter what. The villagers exchanged anxious glances. But most agreed. As the sun began to set again, and the gray light dipped low, every home in Eldom began to prepare. Fires were stacked high. Windows were barred. Families huddled close. The air grew colder, colder than the day before, almost unnaturally so. And just before full dark, the footprints returned. This time, not just one set, but three. They came from the woods again, weaving between the frozen tree trunks like silent messengers. 3 sets, side by side at first, then scattering apart near the old well. The snow was fresh, undisturbed, except for these. No animals had moved. No human feet had wandered. Only those prints, impossibly deep, almost pressed into the earth beneath the snow. Tomas spotted them first during his evening round with Alder and young Rin, the miller's son. He didn't speak for several seconds, just stared. The footprints were clearer than before, more deliberate. The toes pointed inward slightly, and the stride was longer, dragging in a way that looked wrong. 3 of them, Tomas muttered. Same shape. They're bigger, Rin whispered. Wider than mine. That one's twice the size of your boot, Tomas. Alder shook his head and stepped back. Could be a trick. Someone trying to scare us. Then why don't they ever lead away? Tomas asked quietly. They come in, they stop, and they vanish. No one had an answer. They followed the tracks cautiously as the last light of day slipped behind the hills. One trail curved near the chapel and stopped in front of the altar's small, frost-covered door. Another moved toward the center of the village, where the bakery stood. The third set, longest of all, led straight to the outer edge of the village, where old Marjorie's body had just been buried beneath a crude mound of snow-covered stones. That last set stopped at the foot of her grave. No movement, no further tracks, just a haunting stillness. Tomas didn't let them follow any farther. Enough. We go back. Now. They returned to their homes without speaking, but their faces said enough. The village of Eldam, hardened by winters and hunger and pain, had not looked this afraid in years. Not even during the fever 2 winters ago, when half the children had fallen ill. This fear was deeper, quieter. It sat in their bones. Inside Tomas's cottage, Mira stood by the fire, holding the small pouch of dried herbs from Marjorie's table. She hadn't let go of it since they returned with her father's body that morning. She didn't know why, but something about it felt important. When Tomas entered, she held it up. Should we burn it? He didn't answer right away. Then, gently, he nodded. Tonight, yes. Before full dark. So Betta lit a second fire near the hearth, just a small bowl with dried ash from the oak logs they'd saved and the lavender crushed finely into the bottom. Mira placed the bundle inside. The scent that rose was bitter and earthy, almost metallic. It filled the room, and they sat together in silence, watching the thin curls of smoke rise into the rafters. I don't like how the air feels, Betta whispered. It's too quiet. It's always quiet, Tomas said. But he felt it too. Outside, other households followed suit. Those who had herbs burned them. Those who didn't stayed near the fire and told old prayers. Whispers passed down for generations who knew winters like this and feared them. Some claimed to hear the knocks that night. One came at the home of the old baker, Haurik, who lived alone now that his wife had passed last spring. He sat by the fire, his hands curled over a warm mug of broth, when a knock came. 3 times. Slow. Measured. He didn't answer. Not the first time. Not the second time, when it came again, this time on the back wall of the house, where there was no door. The third knock came hours later. Just one. Just loud enough to wake him from the doze he'd slipped into. When dawn broke, Haurik was found sitting upright in his chair, pale and cold. The fire had gone out. The cup had spilled, but there were no marks, no bruises, no signs of struggle, just a smear of snow beneath the window. News spread quickly again. 3 knocks, 3 sets of prints, 3 homes visited, and only 1 death. The villagers didn't talk loudly anymore. They murmured. Even the children were quieter now. Something was moving in the woods, something that didn't feel hunger or sleep or warmth. Father Elric was still missing. The chapel bell rang again just after noon, once and then stopped. Tomas decided it was time to act. We can't just wait, he said to the gathered men and women outside the bakery. We need to know what this is. What wants? If it's something old, something forgotten, we have to face it, not hide from it. Some agreed. Others looked uncertain. Alder crossed his arms. And if it wants us to come looking, what then? Then we'll know what we're up against, Tomas replied. That evening, as the sun dipped again behind thick gray clouds, Tomas, Alder, Rin, and two others, Lena and Barrick, set off into the woods, following the trail of the first set of prints. They moved slowly, torches lit, weapons in hand. The snow was deeper here. The trees leaned in close, branches heavy with frost. The trail went farther than they expected. Much farther. They passed the hunting path, the old charcoal pit, even the ruins of a forgotten watchtower from some long-lost war. Still the prints continued. At last, they reached a clearing. In its center stood a ring of stones, old, broken, half swallowed by roots and moss. A circle worn smooth by time. In the middle, a low platform of blackened stone, and on it, a pile of bones. Not animal. Not anymore. Somewhere in the trees behind them, a twig snapped. Everyone froze. Rin turned slowly. His torch flickered. No one spoke. Then they saw it. Just between two trees, barely visible, more shadow than form. A figure. Tall. Thin. Still. Watching. It didn't move. It didn't blink. Then stepped back and vanished. The prints at their feet, previously cold and frozen, began to steam. That was when the torches sputtered. The flames dimmed to thin, orange threads. Tomas didn't wait. Back. Now. They ran through the snow, stumbling and slipping, hearts pounding, eyes darting toward every shadow. But the figure did not follow. Not yet. Back in the village, Mira sat beside the fire, feeling the herbs in her lap again. The scent had faded, but the fear hadn't. She thought of the stories, the frost man, the whisperers, the hollow walkers. But those were just bedtime tales, weren't they? Then the knocking started again. Not at the door, but at the window. Slow, deliberate, just once. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. And across the village, the chapel bell rang again. 4 times. Mira couldn't look away from the window. The knock had come and gone, but its echo pulsed through her bones like a drumbeat. A single knock, soft but certain, on glass thick with frost. She sat frozen, the old herb pouch clenched in her hand. The fire crackled behind her. Betta hadn't noticed the sound, still humming gently to Jack as he drifted off in her lap. Only Mira had heard it. Or had she? She wanted to believe it was nothing. The wind, maybe. A branch. But there were no trees near that side of the house, and the window sat well above the ground. Nothing natural could reach it, not without effort, and certainly not without leaving marks. She inched forward, heart hammering in her ears, and peeked at the frosted glass. There was no one there, but on the pane was a shape, a smudge where someone, had touched it. Not a handprint. It was longer than a hand, thinner, almost claw-like. 3 lines, etched through the frost like burn marks, as if made by something too cold to be real. She backed away and sat down slowly, trying not to startle her mother. Betta's lullaby faltered, sensing the tension in her daughter's posture. "What is it?" she asked. Mira shook her head. "Nothing. Just the wind." Betta frowned but didn't press. She pulled Mira closer and wrapped her arms around both children. "We'll get through it," she whispered. "This winter will pass." They always do. But deep down, Mira wasn't so sure. Something was different this time. It wasn't just the cold. It was the way the air seemed too still after sunset. The way the fire never quite felt warm enough. And how the footprints in the snow were never covered by new flakes, as though even the weather didn't dare bury them. Far beyond their little home, Tomas and the others were still running. The woods felt endless now, the trees closer, the wind louder. Rin stumbled, scraping his knee on a jagged rock, but Tomas pulled him up without a word. Their torches were all but out. The shadows had grown teeth. Finally, the lights of the village blinked through the trees. One by one, they crossed the boundary back into Eldom, panting, wide-eyed, and shaking. Barrick vomited behind a stack of crates. Lena fell to her knees and muttered a prayer no one could hear. Alder didn't speak at all. He just stared back at the path they had come from, watching, waiting. Tomas ran straight to his home. Inside, Betta rose at once. "What happened? Where did you go?" He shook his head, caught his breath, then looked at Mira. You were right. Mira stood up. It followed us, didn't it? Tomas didn't answer, but the look in his eyes said enough. That night, the villagers didn't sleep. They kept fires lit in every corner. They hung charms over their doorways, some made from iron, others from bone, string, or bundles of dried herbs that Marjorie had sold over the years. Mira kept the fire burning herself, watching each ember fall and rise, unwilling to look away even for a second. Then, sometime after midnight, it began again. Not knocking this time, scraping. It started at the blacksmith's door, a soft, dragging sound like fingernails trailing across the wood. Then silence. Then a second scrape, this one on the other side of the house. Alder, inside, gripped his hammer and didn't move. He wouldn't open the door. Not again. At the bakery, Howrick's old assistant, Inna, heard it too. She crouched with her baby under the table, hands over the child's ears, listening to the slow, deliberate circle of something walking around the building. The steps were too heavy for an animal, too smooth for a man. At the chapel, the bell rang one last time. Not 4, not 5, 6. Tomas heard it and stood at once. No, Bettis said. Don't go out again. Please. He turned to her, and for once, he had no answer. He was tired, more than tired. Whatever they had found in the woods wasn't something he could fight. It wasn't a bandit or beast. It was something forgotten, something old, older than Eldom, older than the tower or the ruins in the woods, maybe even older than the language they spoke. We need to find out what it wants, he said, before someone else dies. Mira stepped forward. What if it doesn't want anything? Everyone looked at her. What if it's just hungry, she said softly. Not for food, for warmth, for life. Maybe it's just drawn to us because we're the only warmth left. Tomas looked thoughtful, but Betta shook her head. Then we keep the fires burning. We stay together. We don't let it in. But what if keeping it out just makes it angry? Mira whispered. There was no answer. That night, they made a plan. They would send a group to the abbey 2 villages away at first light. Maybe the monks there would know something, some ritual, some history. Maybe they had books that spoke of creatures like this. Or maybe they just had stronger walls. But dawn never came. The sun did not rise that morning. The skies stayed dark, as if frozen in the hour before light. The wind stopped. The trees stood still. Snow no longer fell, but the world seemed suspended in some unnatural moment. Like time itself refused to move forward. The villagers gathered near the square, silent and tense. No one knew what to say. A few brave ones went to check the woods again. The prints were still there. Now 4 sets. One set ended just outside Myra's window, the same place where the knock had come. The smudge was still on the glass. And this time, the final set led to the center of the square, then disappeared without a trace. Tomas looked at the people of Eldom, then up at the sky. I think it's waiting, he said. For what? Someone asked. But he didn't know, and neither did Mira. She only knew that this winter was no longer a season. It was a sentence, one that hadn't been finished yet. The village of Eldom had always followed the rhythm of nature, seed, harvest, snow, thaw. But now that rhythm was broken. Time felt uncertain, like the sky had forgotten how to turn. Without the sun rising, the village remained in a strange half-light, where the snow no longer sparkled and the wind carried no scent. Days blended into nights, and no one could say for sure how long they had been living like this. A week? A month? It was hard to count time when even the roosters had stopped crowing. Inside Tomas's home, the fire had become the center of everything. They sat around it in shifts, feeding it constantly, never letting it shrink to embers. Mira stayed up late most nights, refusing to sleep for more than an hour or 2. Her dreams had turned strange, full of twisted trees, doors that opened to black water, and shadows that whispered in voices she almost recognized. Every time she woke up, the air felt colder, like something had drawn closer while her eyes were closed. Betta tried to keep normal routines. She still heated broth, still mended torn gloves, still sang to Jack. But even her lullabies had softened into hums, as though words had grown too heavy to speak aloud. Jack, who once played in the snow and begged for stories, barely spoke at all now. He clung to his mother like a second skin, and sometimes stared for hours at the window, as if waiting for someone. One evening, Mira finally asked her father what he saw in the woods that day. Not the prints, not the stones, the thing between the trees. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I saw something that didn't move like a man. It stood wrong, like it had forgotten how to stand." "Do you think it's one of the old ones?" she asked. Tomas didn't answer. He had heard stories growing up, legends whispered by candlelight during long winters. Stories of spirits left behind when the world moved on, of beings that weren't alive but weren't dead either. Things that slept under roots or ice and woke only when forgotten. "There was a name they used in the north," he said finally. "Not a name we should say, but they called it the Hollow Frost." Mira swallowed hard. She had heard that name once, from Marjorie, when she was small. She had thought it was just a tale to scare children into staying close to the fire. Something to explain the death of a lost traveler or why the dogs howled on certain nights. But now, she wasn't so sure. The village council met again, though no one called it that out loud. They gathered in silence near the old smithy, bundled in layers, carrying torches even though it wasn't truly night anymore. Alder looked older now, his beard streaked with gray, his voice quieter. Varric wouldn't speak of the woods. Rin stayed behind, too frightened to leave his home again. Lena brought with her a sack of dried roots, insisting they might be useful for warding. "What do we do if it doesn't end?" Varric finally asked. Tomas didn't speak right away. He stared into the trees. "It's not a storm," he said. "It's not something we can wait out. If it's something old, something bound to this land, then maybe we've disturbed it. Or maybe we've forgotten something we were supposed to remember." Lena stepped forward. "There's something I've been thinking about. Marjorie wasn't just a healer. She was the last one who remembered the old ways. The blessings. The protections. Maybe she kept it away all these years. But now she's gone," Alder said, "and it's not staying away anymore." That thought hung heavy in the air. Some began to search through their homes for scraps of parchment, old carvings, anything Marjorie might have left behind. One boy, hardly older than Mira, brought forward a wooden token, a charm his mother said Marjorie had given her years ago when he was sick. It looked simple, a round piece of ash wood with a spiral burned into the center. Mira stared at it for a long time. Something about it stirred a memory, not a clear one, but a feeling like being watched in the woods, or that strange warmth when the fire flared unexpectedly. She took the charm and held it close. "I think this is a key." "To what?" someone asked. "To understanding what this thing is," she said. That night, she slept with the charm under her pillow, and for the first time in days, she dreamed clearly. She saw the village, not as it was now, but as it had been long ago. No stone chapel, no iron bell, no carved roads. Just wooden homes, smoke rising into the winter sky. She saw people gathered in a circle around a fire in the clearing, the same clearing Tomas had found. In the center stood a woman, not Marjorie, but someone like her, older, cloaked, speaking words Mira couldn't understand. Behind her, a tall shape waited. It didn't move. It didn't speak. But Mira felt its presence, ancient and cold and watching. The people bowed their heads, laid small bundles at its feet. Herbs, carved stones, bits of fur. Offerings. When the woman stepped back, the figure turned and vanished into the woods. Then Mira woke up, her face wet with tears and breath caught in her throat. She told Tomas everything. He didn't doubt her. Not anymore. "We stopped honoring it," he said. "Whatever it was. We built over its place. Forgot the rituals. And now it's come back." "But why now?" Veta asked. "Why this winter?" "Because Marjorie's gone," Mira said softly. She was the last one who remembered. The chapel bell rang again that afternoon. 7 times. This time, the villagers didn't wait. A group marched to the chapel. Tomas led them. Mira followed, clutching the wooden charm. When they opened the chapel doors, they found Father Elric, but not alive. He was kneeling at the altar, eyes closed, hands clasped in prayer. His skin was pale and dusted with frost, and his lips had turned dark blue. The bell rope lay loose beside him, and his Bible was open to a page long faded. One word had been underlined again and again, so deeply that it had torn through the page. Remembrance. They buried him beside Marjorie that evening. Quietly. No prayers, no bell. Just silence. And the snow still didn't fall. Mira sat by the fire and stared at the charm in her palm. Its spiral seemed to shift slightly in the light. She whispered, not knowing if anyone, or anything, was listening. "What do you want from us?" Outside, in the woods beyond Eldom, a tree cracked loudly in the stillness. And far in the distance, behind the hills, the wind began to blow again. The wind sounded different this time, lower, almost like a voice carried far from its source. Mira sat up straighter. It had been days, maybe longer, since the wind last moved with any purpose. Now it came in slow, rolling gusts, weaving through the bare trees like a forgotten song being hummed by something unseen. Veta paused in the middle of stirring their thin stew and turned toward the window. Even Jack looked up, blinking as if hearing something his small mind couldn't explain. Tomas came in through the front door, dusted with snow that hadn't fallen in hours. He looked shaken. "I went to the Western Trail," he said, his voice strained. "There are more footprints." Mira frowned. "How many?" "Too many to count," he said. "More than before. Some small, some bigger than any I've seen." Veta covered her mouth with her hand. "Children?" "I don't know," Tomas said. "But they weren't there yesterday. They were moving toward the village." The room felt colder. Even the fire seemed to sink lower in the hearth, its flames shrinking. "I don't think it's just one thing anymore," Tomas added. "I think it's many, or maybe pieces of something." That night, the charm burned warm in Myra's pocket. Not hot, but warm enough to feel alive. She turned it over again and again, tracing the spiral carved into the ash wood, remembering her dream. The ring of stones, the silent shape, the offerings. She couldn't shake the feeling that the figure in the dream hadn't meant harm. It was ancient, yes, but not cruel. It watched because it had been forgotten, neglected, left behind as the world changed, and people stopped believing in anything they couldn't touch. Now it wanted to be remembered. Or else. Mira waited until everyone was asleep, then slipped out into the half-dark. The charm hung around her neck now, tied with a scrap of leather. She carried a small bundle in her arms, dried herbs, a strip of cloth, and a silver button her grandfather had once found in a riverbed. The woods were silent, but not empty. She felt at the moment she stepped beyond the last cottage. The air grew thicker. Time slowed. Her breath curled tightly in the cold. She followed her dream. Through the trees, past the broken stone tower, to the clearing. It was darker here, though the sky above held no clouds. The air carried no snow, no rain. Just silence. At the center stood the stones, tall, smooth, and ancient. They didn't look like the rest of the forest. They didn't belong to time. Mira stepped into the circle and placed her bundle on the stone altar. Then she waited. For a long time, nothing happened. She started to shiver. The wind died again. The charm at her neck pulsed faintly. Then from the woods came a sound like footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching the snow without hurrying. Mira turned, but saw no one. Her hands began to shake. "I came to remember you," she said out loud. "I don't know your name. I don't know your story. But I know we forgot you. I'm sorry." The wind picked up again. A soft whisper. Then a second. Then dozens like voices layered over each other. Not speaking words, but feelings, loneliness, cold, hunger, waiting. Mira closed her eyes. The charm burned hotter now. The ground beneath her feet vibrated faintly. Behind her, a shape began to form. Not from smoke, not from shadow, but from cold itself. Like frost bending into a figure. Tall, thin, hollow. It didn't speak, but bowed its head. Mira reached out, unsure why, and touched the stone at the center of the circle. It was freezing, but not painful. The whispering stopped. Then, a single word entered her mind, not spoken aloud, but placed there like a memory. "Remember." And the shape was gone. The wind fell still. The charm cooled. Mira opened her eyes. She stood alone in the clearing. When she returned to the village, the sky had begun to lighten, not into full daylight, but into something softer. A pale, gray glow, almost like the horizon was trying to wake up. She found Tomas still awake by the fire. He looked up, startled, but didn't scold her. "You went there, didn't you?" he asked. She nodded. "And I think it just wanted to be known again," she said. That place, the stones, they weren't just for ceremony. They were a promise. Tomas studied her face, then looked toward the window. "Do you think that's enough?" "I don't know," she said. But something changed. The wind. The light. It's like it heard me. Over the next few days, small things began to shift. The snow, which had sat still and frozen, began to soften. A bird was seen flitting between trees, a sign no one had seen since before the stillness began. The fires burned stronger. The children spoke again. People walked a little farther from home, and no new footprints appeared. But the sky still held that pale, strange light. Mira visited the stone circle again, this time with others. They brought offerings, not of fear, but of memory. Bits of the past. Things they had kept in drawers and under floorboards. Things Marjorie might have buried if she were still alive. They didn't perform a ritual. They just stood together, heads bowed, and remembered the world before this winter. And the cold didn't press quite so hard against their backs. That night, as Mira fell asleep with the charm beside her pillow, she dreamed again, not of warnings, but of warmth, of the sun, of a voice, old and kind, whispering from beneath the earth. Some winters come not to take, but to teach. But when she woke, the light outside the window had not yet changed. And in the distance, the chapel bell rang once more. This time, 8 times, and still no one knew what it meant. Tomas was the first to hear the bell. He had risen early, hoping to catch signs of a sunrise that never quite arrived. He stood at the window, rubbing a calloused hand over his stubbled chin, eyes locked on the horizon where morning used to break. But there was no gold, no warmth, only that dull, silver haze that now passed for daylight. Then came the sound, clear, deliberate, 8 slow chimes that rang out like the heartbeat of something buried deep beneath the snow. He turned quickly, waking Betta with a whisper and Mira with a gentle nudge. Neither asked what the sound was. They knew. Everyone did. By the time they stepped into the village square, others were already gathered, hushed, waiting. The bell hadn't rung again. Its rope hung still, untouched. No one had gone near it. It was as if the sound had come from somewhere else, though they all saw it sway with their own eyes. Alder stood stiffly by the chapel steps, his hand resting on the iron handle of his hammer. He looked less like a blacksmith and more like a man preparing to meet a truth he didn't believe in. 8, he said flatly. What does 8 mean? Tomas didn't respond. Mira stepped closer to the group, heart thudding, her hand once again touching the charm beneath her coat. It's counting, she said. Each night it's rung once more. 1, then 2, then 3. Last night 7, now 8. But counting to what? Lena asked. A warning? A deadline? Mira hesitated. Maybe both. There was a long silence. The villagers turned slowly toward Tomas. He was the one they trusted to speak now, though no one had voted him leader. He had simply earned it, the way winter crowns the trees with snow without being asked. We need to go back to the stones, Tomas said. And not just to watch. We need to find out what we're being warned about, what the 8th bell means. Alder scoffed, but not with full confidence. And what if the 9th is the last? Then we've only got one more night, Tomas replied. He didn't wait for arguments. He simply turned and walked, the snow crunching beneath his boots. Mira followed first, then Betta, then Lena. The rest came slowly, forming a silent procession through the woods. The trees watched. That's how it felt, like each branch was bending ever so slightly, listening to their movements. Even without wind, the woods whispered. The clearing appeared just as before, still crowned by the ancient stones, the central platform dark with cold and time. But now, something had changed. Scattered around the stones were new objects. Not offerings, but remnants, frozen buttons, scraps of fabric, a child's wooden toy, half sunk into the snow. No one in the village had placed them there. Mira stepped forward carefully. She crouched and lifted the toy, a little wooden cart with missing wheels. It was familiar, not in design, but in feeling. It hummed softly in her hand, the way her charm had. Her breath caught in her throat. It's happening again, she said. The forgetting. But this time, it's not just the past. It's us. Tomas frowned. What do you mean? It's collecting things. Pieces of us. Of what we left behind. It's not just reminding us, it's warning us. If we don't remember what matters, what connects us, it'll take it all. Betta knelt beside her. Is that what the bells are? A countdown to forgetting. Mira nodded. To losing everything. The group stood in stunned silence. For the first time, the fear that had gripped them for weeks now settled into something heavier. Responsibility. This wasn't a curse that had fallen from nowhere. This was something they had helped create by forgetting, by ignoring the old ways, by thinking survival meant only food and fire. The stones, the altar, the dreams, they weren't about punishment. They were about memory. That night, every household lit 2 fires, one for warmth and one for remembrance. They brought out old heirlooms, letters, carvings. Mira held a gathering in the square and asked each family to share a story of someone they'd lost, something they'd learned, or something they'd once believed but let go. Alder told of his father, who used to walk the forest alone in winter to leave small gifts beneath certain trees. Not for people, but for the watchers, he called them. Lena spoke of her mother's lullabies, sung in a language no one had spoken in Eldom for decades. Betta recited the first words her grandmother had taught her to say when tending the fire. For light, for warmth, for memory. Even Jack whispered a memory of the first snow he ever saw, how it fell so silently he thought it had forgotten to make noise. As each voice filled the space, the wind returned, not harsh, not biting. It circled them gently, as if listening. The air grew clearer. Mira swore she saw the sky shift, not brighter but wider. Deeper, as if something had cracked open above. Still, the bell rang again. 9. Louder this time. But this time, no one ran. Instead, Mira stood in the square and lifted her voice, not loud but steady. We remember, she said, and the wind carried it. Back in her home, the charm pulsed like a heartbeat. She didn't dream of the hollow figure that night. Instead, she dreamed of the stones in full summer light, surrounded by laughter and warmth. Of songs sung without fear. Of hands joined in peace. She woke before the 10th bell. Outside, the village was still. The fires had gone cold, but no one felt the frost. Tomas stood beside the window, hand resting on the sill, eyes fixed on the horizon. Then it happened. For the first time in weeks, the sky cracked open just slightly, revealing the faintest line of gold. The sun was trying to rise, but the bell had not yet rung. And as they waited, hearts suspended between dread and hope, Mira whispered the question no one dared ask aloud. What happens if it rings 10? The village held its breath. No one moved. No one even blinked. The pale line of gold along the horizon didn't spread like it once would have. It just lingered there, hesitant, trembling, as if even the sun was unsure whether it was allowed to return. Mira stood at the threshold of their home, the charm hanging heavy around her neck. Her fingers pressed into it tightly, her breath shallow. Tomas stepped up beside her and laid a hand on her shoulder. Still nothing, he murmured. Maybe 9 was the end. Mira didn't answer. Deep down, something told her it wasn't over yet. The wind had stopped again. The light on the horizon hadn't moved. And the silence, the terrible, glassy silence, pressed on them all like a held breath. Then the bell rang. Once, twice, 3 times. By the 4th, people had begun to stumble out of their homes. 5, 6, 7. Children clung to their parents. Torches flared, even though there was no darkness. 8, 9. The 10th ring came slower than the rest. And then silence again. This time it wasn't hollow. It was full, the kind of silence that came after something had arrived. Alder looked around, eyes wide and unblinking. That's it, he said. It's here. No one argued. Tomas raised his voice, not shouting, but loud enough to carry through the frozen air. Everyone to the square. Bring everything you want remembered. Now, they didn't need to be told twice. The people of Eldom moved quickly, children clutching old toys, mothers carrying cloth-bound journals, fathers with carvings, trinkets, worn tools, bones wrapped in ribbon. Every item told a story. Every story became an offering. Mira led them back to the clearing in the woods. This time, the path felt different, lighter, as if the trees themselves leaned back to let them pass. Even the snow had softened under their feet, no longer dragging at their steps. But the air still held that strange energy, as if something very old and very awake was waiting. They reached the ring of stones together. Tomas stepped into the circle first, placing a worn leather satchel on the altar. It had belonged to his father, and before that, to his grandfather. He said nothing, just pressed a hand to it and stepped back. One by one, the villagers followed. Lena offered a faded prayer ribbon. Alder left behind his father's bellows, still smelling faintly of smoke. Betta laid down a scarf her mother had knit with wool she'd spun herself. Jack placed a carved fox, no larger than his palm, beside the other objects. Mira stepped in last. She held the charm in her hand. It was warm now, not burning but steady. She placed it at the very center of the altar, atop the other offerings, and spoke. "We forgot you," she said. "We forgot what kept us whole. But we remember now." The wind rose, not violently, but in a spiral around them, lifting hair, tugging gently at cloaks, spinning snowflakes into tiny stars. The air grew thicker, charged, as if it were waiting for something final. And then, in the center of the circle, something appeared. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even a shape, really. It was a presence, tall, hollow, built of the cold itself. Like a shadow pulled from the heart of winter. It didn't threaten. It didn't speak. But it bowed its head. Mira took a trembling step forward. "You're not here to take, are you?" The shape didn't move, but the air rippled. Not in sound, but in memory. Mira saw flashes of winters long past, of offerings made at the stones, of villages warmed not just by fire, but by unity. These moments weren't hers, yet she knew them. They were what the village used to be, before time and fear and hunger had made people forget. It wasn't the cold that had brought the hollow frost. It was the forgetting. Betta stepped beside her daughter, her voice quiet. "We let the silence grow too long." Tomas joined them. "But we won't anymore." One by one, the villagers placed their hands over their offerings. The presence in the clearing began to rise, taller now, the wind circling faster, lifting snow from the ground. Light flickered through the trees, not golden like sunrise, but silver blue, like ice reflecting moonlight. Then came a sound. Not the bell, not a knock. It was a breath. The kind of breath you release when the weight on your chest finally lifts. The presence began to fade, and as it did, the air grew warmer. Not summer warm, but enough that their breath no longer showed. Enough that the frost lifted from their clothes. The sky lightened. The faint glow at the horizon began to spread, slowly, softly, like shy fingers pulling back a curtain. The sun, long held behind the veil of cold memory, rose at last. The villagers stood in silence, watching the light touch their faces. They cried, some of them, not from fear, not from grief, but from recognition. Mira reached for the charm, but it was gone, absorbed into the circle. Returned. She didn't need it anymore, because now they all remembered. Later, as they walked back to the village, Tomas placed a hand on Myra's shoulder. "You were brave," he said. She shook her head. "No, just curious, and tired of being afraid." "Still brave," he said with a smile. That evening, the fires burned, not out of fear, but celebration. People told stories, real stories. They laughed, they sang, they danced slowly in the open square. It was the first time music had been heard in Eldam in weeks. They didn't speak of the hollow frost anymore, not with dread. They spoke of it as a guardian, a keeper of memory, something old that had never meant harm, but simply could not live in silence. The bells no longer rang at night. But each year, as winter deepened and the days grew short, the village would walk to the clearing. They would bring offerings, not out of fear, but to remember, to say, "Asterisk, we still see you. We still know who we are, asterisk." And as long as they did, the frost never grew too deep. The nights never stayed too long, and the silence never returned. For a time, the village settled. The days still passed in muted gray, the sun low and soft, but returned now, enough to mark time again, enough to remember that the world still turned. People began to tend to their animals, patch broken fences, and scrape snow from the paths with new energy. Eldom wasn't healed, but it had hope again. Still, Mira couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't finished. At night, she often woke to silence, not the choking kind they had survived weeks earlier, but a deep, thoughtful quiet. She sometimes stood by the window and looked toward the forest, waiting for the wind to shift, half expecting to see the hollow frost standing among the trees again. It never came, yet the feeling it had left behind still lingered, like it had left a mark on her, on the village, maybe even on the land itself. Then the dreams began again. They were different now, less about fear and more like warnings dressed in symbols. Mira saw firelight flickering inside the chapel, though no one had gone near it in days. She saw the altar from the stone's circle crumbling, the offerings scattered by wind. She saw the bell ringing without a rope, swinging in slow motion, as if something unseen was counting again. One morning, she shared the dream with Tomas. He listened closely, his brow furrowed. "It's not finished," he said, voicing the thought she had been avoiding. "We woke something older than memory. Maybe we soothed it, but did we understand it? That was the problem. They had honored what they had forgotten, but they didn't yet know what it truly was." And then the children started hearing whispers. It began with Rin's younger sister, Anya. She wandered from her bed during the night, barefoot in the snow, and was found standing outside the chapel at dawn, eyes wide, lips moving but saying nothing. When they brought her inside, she couldn't speak for hours. When she finally did, all she said was, "It asked me if I remembered." That same day, Tomas found the spiral symbol carved into the trees near the old well. 5 symbols, perfectly etched. No one in the village claimed responsibility. Mira ran her fingers across the lines. The grooves were clean, too clean, not made with any tool they knew. Almost burned in, but there had been no smoke. Other children began waking at strange hours. Some cried, some sat and stared. Some, like Jack, simply stood near windows and whispered things they didn't understand. Words from the old tongue, fragments Marjorie had once used in her herb songs. Words that hadn't been spoken aloud since the elder healers died off generations ago. A council was called, though no one used the word council anymore. They gathered near the bakery, just like before. Fewer smiles now. The joy of surviving had given way to unease. "It's spreading," Alder said, glancing around. "Whatever this is, it didn't end when the bell stopped. It just changed form." Betta stepped forward, holding a bundle of herbs that had wilted overnight despite being dried properly. "I think it's in the roots," she said. "The land's still holding something." Tomas looked at Mira. "Do you think the hollow frost is still here?" "I don't know," she said, "but I think it left the door open. Something else might have come through." No one responded to that. Not right away. The subtlest signs grew clearer each day. The animals, once calm, began to act skittish again, especially near the chapel. Chickens refused to go near the bell tower. A goat was found pawing at the frozen ground, digging until its hooves bled. When they pulled it back, they found an old iron key buried beneath the frost. No one recognized it. No one knew how long it had been there. Mira kept dreaming. She dreamed of a time before Eldom, before any houses or roads. A fire in the woods, faces half painted in ash, hands raised not in fear, but in reverence. And a name, whispered again and again. Not a human name, but a word older than language. It felt important, but she never remembered it when she woke. Only the feeling remained. Something forgotten was still waiting to be remembered fully. As the days passed, the villagers began to disagree. Some believed the old ways needed to be fully restored, that the offerings at the stones must be made weekly, with song and ritual. Others, like Alder, said they had done enough and needed to move on. Lena began drawing new spirals in her home, lighting candles beside each one. She said the dreams told her to. But then her daughter grew sick, fevered, eyes dull, whispering that the bell will ring again, but not for us. They called him Betta and Mira. They tried everything they knew. Old teas, warmed milk, herbs wrapped in cloth. But the girl didn't improve. Her voice changed. She began reciting riddles no one had taught her. On the third night, the child sat up in her bed and said clearly, "It's not one spirit. It's many." Some forgot who they were. Now, they were winter like a cloak. The room fell silent. Later, Mira found Tomas alone in the chapel, staring at the altar. He held the old key they'd dug up near the goat. "This used to be a place of comfort," he said. "Now it feels like a doorway." "To what?" Mira asked. He shook his head slowly. "I'm not sure, but I think Marjorie knew more than she ever told us." They searched her cottage again, this time thoroughly. Under a floorboard near the hearth, Mira found a small journal wrapped in cloth. The pages were brittle, filled with scrawled notes, recipes, symbols, and memories written in the old tongue. At the very back, they found a single page, torn and retaped. "When the 10th bell rings, memory stirs. But what walks after may not remember being human. Find the name. Seal the voice. Mark the threshold." It was a warning, or maybe a guide, but they didn't understand it yet. That night, Mira lay awake staring at the rafters, clutching the journal close to her chest. She didn't know what the threshold was, or whose voice needed sealing. But she did know one thing. The hollow frost had never wanted harm. But not everything that followed it into their world shared that same quiet patience. And as wind returned to the trees, low and cold, Mira understood the true conflict had just begun. The wind didn't howl that night. It murmured, as if testing the boundaries of what it could slip through, windows left ajar, chimneys with old soot, floorboards that no longer sealed tight. Mira could hear it whispering as she lay awake, the journal still open on her lap. She traced the faded ink again and again, not just reading the words, but feeling the space around them. Asterisk, bind the name. Seal the voice. Mark the threshold. Asterisk, it sounded like instructions, but they came without explanation, like a ritual half-remembered by a people long gone. She couldn't sleep. At dawn, or what passed for dawn now, she walked to the well. Not to fetch water, but to think. The air was sharp with cold, but not unbearable. She stared at the spiral etched into the stones nearby. It had faded slightly since they'd found it, as if time or warmth dulled its edges. It reminded her of how memory faded when not spoken. How a name, even once known by everyone, could vanish if no one said it anymore. Tomas joined her. He didn't speak at first, only handed her a cup of warm broth and sat beside her. "What do you think it means? Mark the threshold," she asked. He exhaled slowly, his breath curling like smoke. "A threshold's a place between. A crossing point. Could be a doorway. Could be something bigger. Like this village," she said. "Like Eldom." Tomas nodded. "We're on old land. Marjorie always said this place was layered, like skins on an onion. New ways on top of old ones. But the old ones never left." Mira looked around. The snow was quiet. The trees stood still. But there was something behind it all now. A pressure. A watching. Back in the village, tensions grew quietly, like cracks under ice. Some villagers, mostly the older ones, clung to the recent rituals. They lit candles every night. They whispered the old tongue. They kept charms on their doors. But others had begun to resist. Not because they didn't believe, but because they were afraid of believing too much. They thought maybe honoring the old ways was what kept the door open. Maybe remembering had brought more than just the hollow frost. One man, Denrick, had started sleeping in the woodshed, refusing to come near the chapel or the stone circle. "It's not about memory anymore," he told Tomas one evening. "It's about feeding it. And we're feeding it more than stories now." When the chickens began disappearing again, no one wanted to say it aloud. But they all thought it. Not foxes. Not hunger. Something was hungry for something else. Mira and Lena spent hours poring over Marjorie's journal. The old symbols were hard to decipher, but some had matches and carvings around the altar stone. One page listed what looked like months of the year, but in a different order. There were 12 symbols, and 10 of them were crossed out. Only 2 remained, a spiral and a cracked crescent. The cracked crescent appeared again later in the journal, circled in red ink, next to the words, asterisk, voice not buried, only broken. Still calling. Still listening. Asterisk. Mira stared at that sentence for a long time. "What if we didn't close the gate?" she said. You mean with the hollow frost? Lena asked. No, Mira said. I think the hollow frost was the keeper of the gate. A watcher. But when we remembered it, maybe we lifted the lock. Maybe something else got through. They both looked toward the window at the same time, drawn by instinct. The wind had picked up again. But this time, it didn't come in from the woods. It came from underneath. That night, Betta found Jack standing in the cellar. He was barefoot, covered in dust, staring at the wall. When she called his name, he didn't respond. When Tomas picked him up, his hands were ice cold. He looked into their eyes and whispered, "There's someone behind the stones, under the floor." They didn't ask what he meant. They didn't want to know. But Mira did. She went back to the stone circle alone, carrying Marjorie's journal and the charm that had mysteriously reappeared on her windowsill that morning. The wind didn't follow her this time. It waited. She stood at the center of the stones and read the final page aloud. Here we lay memory, and with it, the breath of those forgotten. We bind the name. We seal the voice. We mark the threshold, not to trap, but to remember. She placed her hand on the stone. At first, nothing happened. Then, something deep below her feet shifted. Not a tremor, just a sound. A long, slow exhale. And then a voice, not loud, not sharp, but endless. You remember me now. It wasn't a question. It was a fact. Mira backed away, heart pounding. The ground at the center of the circle began to darken. Not wet, not cracked, just darker. As if the earth had opened an eye. From that patch, frost spread again, radiating out in a perfect spiral. The same spiral on her charm. The same as in the book, as on the trees. But this time it didn't stop. It reached the outer stones, then the trees, then the edge of the village. People saw it crawling across the snow like veins of ice. They started screaming. Mira ran. By the time she reached the square, the frost was already at Alder's Forge. The bell rang again, once, though no one had pulled the rope. Lena met her at the chapel steps, face pale, eyes wide. There's a voice in the walls, she whispered. I heard it behind the altar. It said, you woke the wrong one. Inside the chapel, something was burning. Not fire, not smoke, but memory. Pages turned themselves. The altar cracked. The old stone behind it, once part of the original chapel foundation, now glowed with faint blue lines, symbols no one had ever noticed. Not carvings, wounds. Mira stepped forward and whispered the only word she could remember from her dreams. A name she hadn't spoken out loud. Calran. The wind stopped. Everything stopped. Even the frost, mid-creep, froze in place. Then the chapel shook. The bell fell. And a voice, familiar and hollow, spoke from every corner of Eldom. You remember the Watcher, but not what it watched for. And the 10th bell began to ring again, on its own. Once, twice, 3 times, and still, no one knew what would happen when it reached 10 again. The 7th bell echoed like thunder through the village, but there was no lightning, no clouds, not even a hint of movement in the sky. Just that awful hollow sound, deep as a drum, cold as the grave. Mira felt it in her ribs. Not heard, but felt. She stood frozen outside the chapel, staring at the blue glowing lines carved into the stone wall behind the cracked altar. They pulsed with light that didn't flicker or fade. It was constant, alive, like a heartbeat buried in ice. People ran, some to their homes, some toward the woods. Tomas stood in the middle of the square, shouting for calm. But no one could hear him over the 8th bell. Louder than before, almost angry. Mira reached for him, pulling him into the chapel just as Lena lit the last candle on the floor, surrounded by spirals drawn in ash. We don't have time to guess anymore, Mira said, her voice shaking. This thing, whatever we let through, it's not the hollow frost. That was a warning, a protector. We opened something deeper, something angry. Tomas looked out the chapel door as the 9th bell rang. His hands trembled slightly, but his eyes were steady. Then we need to seal it. Whatever it is, we need to finish what Marjorie couldn't. But we don't know how, Lena said. All we have are half-written spells and a village full of terrified people. We have this, Mira whispered, lifting the journal and pointing to the final line. Mark the threshold. Lena blinked. You think it's here? No, Mira said. I think the threshold is us, this village. The people, what it's been using, what it's been pulling through. Our fear, our memory, it's been feeding on it. She turned, her eyes scanning the chapel again. That voice. Cowrin. I think it's a name. One of the ones that was buried. But it didn't stay buried. Outside, the wind rose again. But this time it didn't whistle. It howled. A real, living howl that stretched through the trees and bounced against the stones. It was full of grief and rage and something else too. Something Mira recognized. Loss. And then came the screams. First just one, then another, and then several, all rising like a wave crashing through the forest's edge. Tomas shoved the chapel door open again, just in time to see Alder stumbling through the snow, blood across his face, pointing behind him with wide eyes. "It's not just wind," he shouted. "It's in the trees." From the edge of the woods, the frost moved faster now, not creeping like before, but rushing. Not just on the ground, but in the air, spiraling through branches, cracking bark, pulling breath from the air like a vacuum. The symbols carved into the trees lit up, one by one, as if called to life by the coming storm. Mira didn't think. She grabbed the charm from her neck and threw it onto the chapel floor. "Help me draw it," she said to Lena. Around the stone, the spiral. "Make it whole." They moved fast, their fingers working in soot, blood, anything they could grab. They redrew the spiral over and over, widening it until it reached the walls, stretching up the stone. Tomas turned to the others flooding in. "Bring anything old, anything passed down, names, stories, objects. It's not just about sealing it. We have to anchor ourselves here. If we forget again, it'll finish what it started." The 10th bell rang. It didn't sound like before. It rang low, deep as thunder under frozen earth. And it didn't stop. It just kept humming, vibrating the chapel walls, shaking the floor under their feet. Outside, the wind howled louder, circling the square. Snow didn't fall. It rose, spinning in clouds like smoke torn from a fire. Mira stumbled back as the lines on the stone wall behind the altar flared brightly, blindingly. The cracked crescent burned into her vision. Then a voice, Cowrin's, spoke again, not in one place, but in all places at once. "You remember the shell, but not the soul." The chapel door burst open with wind, knocking Jack to the ground. Betta screamed, rushing toward him, but he stood on his own. He looked older, not in years, but in the way he stood. He pointed to the spiral Mira had drawn and spoke in a voice that wasn't his. It was never about the winter. It was about what was left behind in it. Then the bell shattered. The sound pierced the village like a scream. Windows cracked. Trees split. The glowing frost froze midair, then shattered like glass. For one long second, the world seemed to pause. And then everything shifted, not physically, not visibly, but inside them. A pressure, a memory, something buried pushing to the surface. Mira fell to her knees, hands to her temples, visions slamming through her. Faces she didn't recognize, lives she hadn't lived. Children walking across bridges made of ice. Women carving runes into stone altars. Men bowing to fire and shadow alike. All ancestors, all forgotten, and they were angry. She gasped and forced herself to speak. "They're not evil. They're not monsters. They're abandoned." Lena clutched her head, shaking. "They want to come through." Tomas grabbed Myra's shoulder, grounding her. "Then we have to show them we still see them, still know them. Even if the names are gone." Outside, the square filled with light. Not firelight, not sunlight, but a bluish glow that hummed like breath. Shapes began to take form in the snow. Not solid, but moving. Not ghosts. Not yet, but close. Mira stood slowly and walked to the chapel door. "We need to finish the spiral," she said. "In the square. With all of us. With everything we can remember. But it's too late," someone cried behind her. "No," Mira said, her voice shaking. "This is the final chance. It's not too late until we choose to forget again." She stepped out into the cold, her feet sinking into snow that didn't feel cold anymore. The shapes watched, waiting, remembering. She dropped to her knees and began drawing again. And behind her, one by one, the others followed, holding their objects, speaking names, building the spiral. marking the threshold, and somewhere beneath the earth, something began to rise. The spiral in the village square grew larger by the minute. The people of Eldom, who had once been too afraid to whisper the name of whatever haunted their nights, were now knee-deep in the snow, carving memory into the ground. Not with tools, but with hands, fingers, and hearts. Each line mattered. Each curve of the spiral was a story, a name remembered, a love lost, a song once sung by candlelight during winters past. Mira moved quickly, her breath puffing out in short bursts, the chill in the air forgotten. Her hands were numb, but she didn't stop. Around her, children placed small wooden toys in the snow. Old women tied faded ribbons to tree branches nearby. Men set down tools handed down from fathers and grandfathers. And all the while they spoke. "My brother's name was Elric," said one. "My mother used to hum a tune when the snow fell." "I still remember it," said another. "We used to dance around the stone circle before the first frost." Each memory became a thread in the spiral. Each name added strength. But still, the wind held above them. Still, the shapes hovered at the edge of the square, neither retreating nor advancing. They were tall and thin, some hunched, some almost glowing, with faces hidden in shadow. Their presence wasn't hateful, but it wasn't kind either. It was demanding, watching, waiting. Jack stood beside Betta now, his small hand still clutched around the charm Mira had dropped earlier. It had found its way back to him, though no one knew how. He was quiet, eyes fixed on the edge of the square where the frost still shimmered unnaturally. Suddenly, he spoke, not to anyone in particular, just loud enough to be heard. "They're not asking for forgiveness. They're asking for place." Mira turned sharply. "What do you mean?" Jack blinked slowly. "They were left behind. They never asked to be forgotten. They lived, they loved, and we let the world move on without them. They don't want to hurt us. But if we ignore them again, they'll take our place to remind the land they still exist." Alder, standing nearby with blood dried at the edge of his beard, growled. "So what do we do? Hand over our homes? Our children?" "No," Mira said firmly. "We share it. That's what they want. We mark the memory, and we make room." She walked to the center of the spiral and placed the journal, Marjorie's journal, into the snow. It opened naturally as though guided. The last page fluttered, then stilled. The ink glowed faintly blue. Mira bent low and pressed her palm to the words, whispering, "We see you. We remember you. We carry you." A gust of wind slammed through the square, throwing snow into the air. The spiral lit up, every line shimmering with a soft, frost-blue glow. It was like a pulse, slow and steady, breathing life back into something that had been dying in silence. The spirits at the edge of the square shifted. A few stepped forward, slow and unsure. Mira could see them more clearly now. They were not monstrous. They wore rags, cloaks of faded wool, garments frayed by time. One held a spinning wheel. Another clutched a satchel filled with herbs. A child among them held a ball of twine, unraveling slowly behind her. Myra's heart twisted. These were people, or had been. Their eyes, if you could call them that, shone with something too human to deny. Then the earth trembled. A low rumble rolled beneath the village, lifting snow in tiny clouds, cracking a stone step near the chapel. People gasped. Children screamed. The spiral pulsed again, brighter this time, but uneven. "We're not done," Tomas called out. "It's not enough." "More names," Lena shouted. "More memories. Keep going." Voices rose. More stories spilled from lips too long sealed in grief or fear. Some cried as they spoke. Some laughed. Some simply whispered names into the air as though they were prayers. Mira closed her eyes. She saw a face, Marjorie's, calm, quiet, nodding. Then another, a face she didn't recognize, but felt in her bones. A tall woman in a fur-lined cloak, hands covered in ash. A fire burned beside her, and around her neck hung the same spiral charm now clutched in Jack's hands. The woman opened her mouth and spoke a single word Mira couldn't understand, but the meaning was clear. Asterisk, remember us, and we will protect you. Forget us, and we will become the cold. Asterisk. The vision vanished. Mira opened her eyes just as the frost at the edge of the square began to retreat. Slowly, cautiously, like a wary animal easing back into the woods. The spirits turned, one by one, and faded into the snow. But one remained, a figure unlike the others, taller, wrapped in a cloak that seemed to be woven of smoke and moonlight. Its face was hidden, but it did not move. Mira stepped toward it, her heart thudding. The charm around Jack's neck grew warm again. She stopped just short of the figure, snow brushing her boots. "What do you want?" she asked softly. The figure raised a hand and pointed, not at her, but at the chapel behind her, at the glowing stone wall. Then in a voice that echoed across the square and deep into their bones, it spoke. "The threshold is closed, but the wound remains." Mira froze. "The wound?" Tomas asked, stepping up beside her. The figure tilted its head slightly. "Not all were remembered. One still waits." And then it was gone, dissolved into snow. The wind died instantly. The light in the spiral faded to a soft blue hue, still glowing, but no longer pulsing. The silence was no longer frightening. But it wasn't peace either. Back in the chapel, the stone behind the altar still hummed, still glowed. Mira stared at it. The word from the journal returned. Asterisk, voice not buried, only broken. Asterisk. She looked at Tomas. "There's still something beneath us," she said. He nodded grimly. "We closed the gate," he said, "but something's still here, still waiting." The village didn't celebrate that night. They rested. They watched the sky. They checked their children's eyes for signs of strange dreams. The spiral remained in the square, glowing softly, now more a mark of promise than fear. But Mira didn't sleep. She sat in front of the chapel, eyes on the altar stone, fingers tracing the edge of the journal. The hollow frost had been a warning. The spirits had been a consequence. But the wound in the earth, the voice still waiting, that was the heart of it. And now that it had been left unseen, it would not wait quietly for long. Mira barely felt the cold anymore. She had been sitting in front of the chapel for hours, her breath soft in the air, watching the horizon for a sun that had grown shy again. The faint glow of the spiral in the village square still pulsed behind her, like a heartbeat slowing down after a long run. But inside the chapel, something remained wide awake. The stone behind the altar had stopped glowing, but Mira could still feel its presence. It was like standing above a deep well, sensing the darkness beneath even when you couldn't see it. Tomas brought her warm water and bread, sitting beside her without a word. The snow around them had settled quietly, like the land was holding its breath. They both knew the calm wouldn't last. "I dreamed again," Mira finally whispered. Tomas looked over at her. "The spirits." She shook her head. "No, someone else. It wasn't a face I've seen before, not even in the visions. But it was wrong, like a shadow wearing a memory. It spoke in a language I didn't understand, but the feeling it gave me," she paused, pressing her fingers to her chest, "it was grief. But not the kind we know. It was the grief of something trapped, something left behind too long." Tomas frowned. "Do you think it's what the spirit meant when it said, 'the wound remains'?" Mira nodded slowly. "I think the bell didn't just count down to the hollow frost. It counted down to a deeper forgetting. We remembered the spirits in time. But maybe there was one memory, one soul we never spoke aloud. And now it's stuck between." Tomas leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "If that's true, what do we do?" "We find it," she said. "We find what we missed." That afternoon, the snow stopped falling. The air cleared just enough to see the trees in the distance, their bare limbs shining with frozen dew. Mira took it as a sign. She called another gathering in the square. Not an emergency, but something quieter. The village had grown, used to urgency. But now it needed focus. Children sat bundled in cloaks, holding hands. Adults stood in small groups, holding candles or worn relics from their homes, whatever helped them feel grounded. Mira stepped into the center of the spiral and looked at each face. "There's still something here," she said plainly. "Something we forgot to remember. Something that isn't angry or hollow, but wounded." Some faces showed fear, others curiosity. A few, like Betta and Lena, just nodded, as if they'd already known this truth in their bones. We honored the spirits, Mira continued. But one name, one soul, was never spoken, and it's waiting, not to harm us, but to be found. Jack stepped forward, holding the spiral charm. He lifted it high above his head and said in a clear voice, "It's under us." A silence fell, deeper than any windless night. The villagers looked to one another, unsure if they had heard the boy right. Myra's gaze turned slowly to the chapel. "The cellar," she said. They moved together. No panic, no rush, just a steady procession through the snow and into the chapel. The air inside was thick, not damp or smoky, just still, like the hush before a thunderstorm. Mira led the way to the back, where a small trapdoor lay hidden beneath an old rug and loose floorboards. It had been there as long as anyone could remember, but no one had ever gone down. Not in living memory. Tomas knelt beside her. "We don't know what's down there." "No," she said softly, "but we know who's waiting." She opened the door. The air that rose from the darkness below wasn't foul. It was cold, ancient, and full of dust that didn't settle. A ladder descended into black. Mira lit a torch and climbed down first. The walls were stone, old stone, rough and uneven, far older than the rest of the chapel. It didn't feel like a cellar. It felt like something else entirely. When her boots touched the packed earth floor, she looked around slowly. The space was larger than expected, arched, curved, like the inside of a sealed dome. Along the walls were faded carvings, spirals, crescents, symbols she recognized from Marjorie's journal. And in the center of the room, half buried in stone, was a slab. An altar. Tomas and Betta followed her down. Others waited above. Mira approached the stone. Her torchlight flickered across the top of it. There was writing, faint, nearly erased by time. She brushed snow and dust away and tried to read it. The words were in the old tongue, worn and incomplete, but one line stood out, scratched deeper than the rest. "Do not forget the keeper of the name." She said it aloud, and the room trembled slightly, like something stirred in the stone beneath their feet. Tomas stepped beside her. "What name?" Mira shook her head. "We've been speaking names for days, but not this one. Whoever lies here." Their name was never spoken again, not even in story. They were erased, not just forgotten. Asterisk sealed away. Asterisk. Betta knelt beside the stone and placed her palm on it. She closed her eyes. "It's a woman," she whispered. "She was the one who built this village." She held the memory, the songs, the stories, and when the old ways were banned, they erased her first. Mira stared at the stone, heart pounding. She was the threshold. Suddenly, the spiral on Jack's charm began to glow again, faintly at first, then brighter. The same glow lit up the carvings on the walls. The same symbols Mira had seen in her visions. Voices, soft and distant, began to hum through the chamber. Not ghostly, not haunting, but mournful. Asterisk, remember me. Remember me. Asterisk. Tomas gripped Myra's shoulder. "Say it," he said. "I don't know her name." "You do," Betta whispered. "Somewhere in you. You do." Mira closed her eyes. The voices rose. The carvings pulsed. The wind returned, but not through the trees. It came from beneath. And then, like a whisper across fresh snow, the name came to her lips. Eloan. The wind stopped. The glow steadied. And from the stone beneath their feet, a breath rose, long, gentle, warm. It passed through them like light through glass. And Mira knew the wound had been named, and now it could finally begin to heal. But even as the breath of Eloan moved through them, soft and warming, Mira felt something shift, not in peace, but in pressure. A low hum vibrated in her bones. It was so subtle she thought it might be her imagination. Tomas looked at her, then at Betta, and she knew by their faces they felt it too. It wasn't over. Not yet. The glow on the chamber walls began to dim. The torch flickered, then the spiral on Jack's charm pulsed one final time and went dark. Above them, a loud crack echoed through the chapel floor. Not thunder, not footsteps. It was deeper, like stone splintering under weight. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Myra's heart jumped. She turned to Tomas. Did the threshold move? He didn't answer. He was staring at the far wall of the chamber. A crack had formed there, thin, jagged, and fresh. And from the center of that crack, something seeped out. Not light, not shadow, something between. It was like mist, but denser, a color she couldn't name. It didn't spread like smoke, but it moved, slow and deliberate, curling out into the chamber air like fingers feeling their way forward. The voices they'd heard moments earlier faded. The comfort Alolan had brought seemed to vanish as quickly as it had come. Mira stepped back. "What is that?" Betta whispered. "Not Alolan." Tomas moved in front of them instinctively. "Then who?" No one answered, because none of them knew. Then Jack, still standing at the top of the stairs, shouted down, "Someone's outside." The three of them scrambled back up into the chapel, bursting out into the village square. The sky was shifting, as if clouds had suddenly realized they were supposed to be moving. The spiral in the snow was gone, completely erased, as if it had never been drawn at all. And in the middle of the square stood a figure. It wasn't like the spirits they had seen before. It didn't shimmer or glow. It was solid, tall, wrapped in dark cloth. Its face was covered by a smooth, featureless mask. No eyes, no mouth, just that mask, still and silent, staring in their direction. People had begun to gather again. Whispers filled the air. "Is that?" "No, that's not one of them." "Where did it come from?" Mira stepped forward cautiously. "Who are you?" she called out. "What do you want?" The figure didn't speak, but Mira heard it, not in her ears, but in her mind. Asterisk. Alolan's voice was the lock. "You have freed the door." Asterisk. Her breath caught. She turned to Tomas. This wasn't about remembering. It was about removing. Betta paled. The threshold wasn't just a seal. It was a prison. The figure tilted its head slowly, as if amused. Asterisk. "She held me here. For centuries. Bound beneath memory. You broke that chain." Asterisk. The mist from a chamber had reached the chapel door now. It curled through the archway, creeping into the square. Wherever it touched the ground, snow melted. Frost receded. The spiral had vanished because this presence didn't need to be invited. It had been waiting for someone to open the door. Myra's voice trembled. "You were never part of the hollow frost." No, the voice echoed like a cold whisper in the back of her skull. Asterisk. "I came before frost. Before spirit. I was buried beneath the names." Asterisk. A gust of wind swept through the square, knocking the last of the charms from doorways. Candles snuffed out. Even the old chapel bell, now broken, gave a hollow clink, like it remembered its purpose one last time. The villagers began to panic. Some ran, some stood frozen. Jack clutched Myra's hand. "We didn't know," she said aloud, not to defend herself, but as if trying to make peace. "We thought she needed to be remembered. We thought it would heal everything." "You remembered her," the voice said calmly. Asterisk. "But you forgot what she kept hidden." Asterisk. The figure raised one long arm and pointed toward the forest. In the distance, the trees began to bend. Not from wind, from weight. Something big was moving among them. Branches snapped. Birds scattered. The ground trembled. And then came the second voice. Not ancient. Not cruel. It was human, clear, strong, and scared. "Help. Please. Someone. I'm not supposed to be here." Everyone turned. From the edge of the woods, stumbling into the open, came a young man in clothes too clean for eldom, his face pale with fear. He looked lost, utterly, completely lost, and no one knew him. He ran toward them, breathless. "Where am I?" "I was just walking home. I swear, I didn't do anything. What is this place?" Mira stared at him, her blood running cold. He was out of place, out of time. Tomas stepped forward. "What year is it where you came from?" The boy blinked. 2025. Gasps rippled through the square. The mist had done more than bring out the buried. It had ripped open something bigger. And now, time itself was bleeding through. The young man stood in the snow, shivering, eyes wide with confusion. His hands trembled not just from the cold, but from the sheer disbelief of where he was. "I don't understand," he kept repeating. "I was just walking down my street, and then there was this fog, and now I'm here." Mira didn't answer right away. Her mind raced, trying to process the impossibility of it. This wasn't just a haunting anymore. This wasn't a forgotten memory seeking a voice. This was something else, something bigger. The tear wasn't just in their village's past. It had reached into the future. Whatever they had unsealed under the chapel wasn't only part of their forgotten history. It had been trapped across time. The masked figure remained motionless at the center of the square, silent, like it had been expecting this. Mira stepped forward slowly, holding up her hand to keep the villagers calm. She approached the figure again, heart pounding. "What are you?" she asked, her voice firm, no longer trembling. "We faced the hollow frost, spirits, memory itself. But you are something different." The voice answered again, not through sound, but through her thoughts. Asterisk, and I'm not bound by time. I'm always left outside of it. She locked me away before your village ever knew itself. And when her name was forgotten, my prison cracked. Asterisk, Mira turned to Tomas, who stood protectively near the boy from the future. It's like Eloan created a seal, not just with words, but with remembrance. She gave us stories, songs, rituals, ways to hold the past in place. But when her name vanished, so did the gate. Betta came forward, gripping her walking staff. We thought remembering would bring peace. But it brought everything. No, Mira said, slowly realizing the truth. It revealed everything. The pain, the protection, the price. The boy, still dazed, looked at them. I don't belong here. I don't know what I did. You didn't do anything, Tomas said gently. You fell through the rip, just like something else is trying to fall through. All around them, the air began to shimmer again, like heat rising from frozen ground. But it wasn't warmth, it was instability. The village square itself seemed to flicker for a moment. Mira looked down. The frost in the ground beneath her boots moved slightly, like it was breathing. Then the crack from the chapel cellar echoed once more, louder, deeper. A sudden roar came from beneath the earth, shaking the chapel so violently that part of its front wall collapsed in a cloud of dust and snow. People screamed. The masked figure lifted its head at the sound, and for the first time took a step forward. Mira knew then this was it, the last moment. They had to act now, or everything they had protected, past and future, would dissolve. Eloan was the keeper of the name, Mira said loudly to the villagers. But her power didn't come from magic or stone. It came from us, from our memory, from our belief in her, in the stories, in each other. She turned to Jack, who still held the spiral charm, now dim. We can do the same. Tomas's eyes locked on hers. You want to seal it again? Not just seal it, Mira said. Asterisk choose it. Asterisk choose to carry the wound, to own it, not bury it. If it's part of us, then it stays with us, but not hidden anymore. Everyone stood still. The masked figure was only a few paces from her now. Mira held her ground. Say her name, Mira shouted. Asterisk, say it now. Asterisk. One by one, voices rose. Eloan, Eloan, Eloan. The spiral charm flickered. Eloan. Children, elders, men and women, every voice joined. The square rang with it. And in that moment, the masked figure stopped. The wind ceased. The shimmer in the air collapsed inward. The frost on the ground began to retreat, curling back into the chapel ruins like smoke pulled into a bottle. The crack in the earth sealed with a sudden snap. The masked figure looked at Mira one final time, and then dissolved into shadow, drawn back beneath the village. Silence. Real silence. The kind that felt earned. The kind that came after survival. Everyone stood still, afraid to breathe too loudly. The boy from the future still stood at the edge of the square, pale but unharmed. The spiral charm around Jack's neck glowed once more, then softly turned to ash and scattered into the wind. Tomas looked to Mira. Is it over? She nodded slowly. Yes, but not forgotten. They spent that night not in fear, but together. People brought bread, blankets, and stories. The boy, his name was Daniel, sat near the fire, still stunned but comforted by the warmth. He spoke of his world, of bright cities and glowing screens, of loneliness in crowds. Eldom, for all its shadows, had something he didn't know he missed. People who truly saw one another. Mira sat by the ruined chapel as the moon rose. She felt Eloan near her, not in shadow, not in fear, but as a presence, a quiet memory living in them all now. Then, just as Mira was about to rise, Daniel approached her. "There's one thing I haven't told anyone yet," he said quietly. She looked up. "When I fell through the mist, I saw someone, a woman. She told me I had to come here, that I had to bring a message." Mira stared at him. "What message?" Daniel hesitated, then spoke. "Asterisk, don't forget the next one. Asterisk." Mira frowned. "The next what?" But Daniel didn't know. And somewhere, far beneath Eldom, the earth gave the faintest sigh, as if something else had just begun to stir. The fires in Eldom burned late into the night. They weren't just for warmth anymore. They were for watching, for staying awake, for holding back the kind of darkness that didn't come from lack of sun. Villagers lingered outside their homes, clustered together in small groups. No one wanted to be alone. Even the bravest among them kept glancing over their shoulders, eyes drawn to the chapel ruins like moths to a haunted flame. Inside Myra's cottage, Daniel sat near the hearth, wrapped in a heavy wool cloak someone had loaned him. His hands still shook occasionally, though the worst had passed. He sipped slowly from a wooden cup, staring into the fire like he was trying to find answers in the flames. Mira sat across from him, journal in hand, scribbling everything she could remember. Names, symbols, words Aloan had whispered, the way the spiral charm had burned away, the message Daniel had brought. Asterisk, don't forget the next one. Asterisk. She repeated it under her breath again and again. It wasn't just a warning. It was a puzzle, a thread left behind on purpose. And whoever Aloan was, or still was, had chosen Daniel, not one of them, to carry it. That mattered. Daniel finally looked up. "Why me?" he asked softly. "Why not someone from here? Someone who already believed in all of this?" Mira didn't have a full answer. She leaned back and said the only truth she knew. "Maybe because you didn't." He frowned. "You were from a world that forgot people like Aloan," she continued, "where names fade fast, where stories don't stay long. Maybe she needed someone like you to remember this time, so it doesn't happen again." He looked down, ashamed. "I still don't understand any of this." "You don't have to," Mira said gently. "You just have to carry it." Later that night, when the others had drifted to sleep and even Tomas had retired to his corner of the room, Mira sat alone with her thoughts. The village had survived. Aloan had returned, briefly, and the mask had been banished. But the earth had stirred again, hadn't it? That low sigh, that subtle shift beneath the ground. Daniel's message. It all pointed to one thing. Something else was coming. Not tomorrow. Maybe not even in her lifetime. But someday. Asterisk, don't forget the next one. Asterisk. What was the next one? Another spirit? Another locked name? A deeper kind of wound? At first light, Mira walked back to the chapel ruins. The frost had not returned, but the air still carried a strange quiet, like the forest was holding its breath again. She climbed down into the old cellar, now more stable, the stone walls humming softly. Not dangerously, just alive. She stood over the altar where Aloan had been sealed. The glow had faded, but she felt a faint warmth, like a hand pressed gently to her shoulder. She whispered a thank you, then turned to leave, and that's when she noticed it. Another crack, but not in the altar. It was beneath it. A stone slab had shifted slightly in the quake, and underneath, embedded in the soil, was a small wooden box, rotted at the corners, wrapped in brittle twine. Mira knelt and pulled it free with shaking hands. She carried it up into the daylight, brushing away soil with her sleeve. Lena met her halfway through the square, wide-eyed. "What is it?" "I don't know yet," Mira said, but it was hidden below Aloan, as if she wanted someone to find it after. They opened it together. The hinges creaked. Inside were three things: a small silver mirror, fogged over from time, a folded piece of parchment tied in red thread, and a single acorn, dried but intact. Lena reached for the parchment and carefully untied the thread. The ink was faded but readable. "To the one who wakes after the forgetting. The keeper is not alone. The veil will thin again, and when it does, the seed must be planted. This is not the end. This is the beginning of the remembering." Mira held the acorn gently in her hand. It looked like nothing special, just an acorn. But Aloan had hidden it for a reason. It was a seed, yes, but of what? A tree? A memory? A protection? She didn't know. Not yet. They passed the note to Tomas, who read it aloud for the village. The people stood silently, absorbing the weight of it. They weren't just recovering from a haunting. They were stewards now, keepers of a story bigger than themselves. Eldom wasn't just their home anymore. It was the edge of something ancient, a place of remembering, and perhaps, one day, of warning. Daniel stayed in Eldom for the next few days. He helped repair roofs, gather firewood, and even draw new spirals in the square, not to trap but to remind. He was quiet, thoughtful. Every night, he asked questions. Every morning, he listened closely to the answers. Mira taught him how to read the old symbols. Tomas showed him how to light a fire without matches. And Betta gave him a story a day. Short ones, long ones, nonsense ones. All with names she insisted not be forgotten. But on the 6th morning, the mist returned. It wasn't like the old frost or the cursed fog. This mist was golden in the light. Gentle, like a door opening rather than closing. Daniel stood at the edge of the village, his boots packed with earth from the old road, the mirror wrapped carefully in cloth, the seed in his pocket. The villagers didn't say goodbye with sadness. They nodded with respect. "You're part of the story now," Mira told him. He smiled slightly. "I'll carry it." And then he walked into the mist. Mira watched until he was gone. Then she turned back toward the chapel. It was time to start writing again. But not a journal. A record. Of Aloan. Of the hollow frost. Of the voice beneath the ground. And of the one who might come next. Spring never truly arrived in Eldom. Not the kind with flowers bursting from the ground or sunshine pouring through the windows. Here the thaw came quietly, slowly, as if the earth itself wasn't sure whether it should breathe again. The snow melted in patches. The river stopped moaning under ice. The air still held a bite, but it no longer carried whispers. Mira stood near the base of the old chapel steps, staring at the square. The spiral had faded again, not from magic but weather. She could redraw it if she wanted, but maybe it was better this way. Not all memory needed to stay carved in the ground. Some of it had to be carried, quietly, steadily, by people who understood its weight. She'd planted the acorn, not in the center of the square, but just beside the chapel ruins. The soil there had been stubborn, still hard with frost a few inches down, but she'd worked it until it gave way. The little seed had disappeared into the earth without protest, like it had always known it belonged there. Lena called it Eloan's root. Others left stones near it. One child had placed a feather. Another, a button from his coat. Nothing dramatic, just offerings, small promises to remember. Tomas, meanwhile, had taken on a new habit. Every morning, he would stand beside the seed's resting place and read aloud from a list of names. Old ones, gathered from the stories Betta told, the songs the children hummed, even the carvings Mira had copied from the cellar walls. Names without faces. Names with no one left to say them. But here, in this space, they lived again. Spoken once. Carried forward. There were no more signs of the masked figure. No more unnatural wind or frost-chasing breath from lungs. But the memory remained. And so did the question. What did Aloan mean by the next one? Mira found herself thinking about it during the quietest hours of the night, when the fire was down to embers and the village slept like a hell breath. Sometimes she thought it meant another sealed spirit, another buried name, a wound in history that hadn't healed. But other times, she wondered if it was something deeper, something not buried, but waiting. There was an unease in her chest she couldn't explain. She'd thought Daniel was a sign, a fluke, maybe, or a messenger. But now, weeks later, she wasn't so sure. He hadn't just stumbled through a tear in time. He'd been called through it, chosen. And if the world could call him once, it could do it again. For someone else, or something else. One night, Mira dreamed of the tree. Not the acorn. The tree, fully grown. Towering, twisting into the clouds. Branches glowing with soft blue light like frost touched by the moon. Around its base, people gathered. Not villagers from Eldom, but strangers. Some in cloaks, others in clothes she didn't recognize. A few carried lanterns that flickered with a fire that didn't burn. And beneath the tree, the spiral pulsed in the soil. Not glowing, just living, breathing. When she woke, her breath was heavy. Her hands ached, and she knew something was shifting again. That morning, she visited Betta, who had taken up carving wood by her hearth. "I need to go to the edge," Mira said. Betta didn't even look up. "I thought you might. I keep feeling it. Something beyond the woods. Beyond the path we never use. Like a hum under everything." "The old path," Betta said. "It was never meant to be walked again." "That's what they always said." "But they also said the chapel was just a chapel," Mira replied. Betta finally looked at her and gave a small, sad smile. "Take a cloak. And bread." By midday, Mira was packed. Not much, just enough for one night. She told Tomas and Lena, who both offered to come, but she refused. "If something is calling," she said, "it's calling me." She followed the sun west, past the edge of the known trail, into the old woods. The snow was softer here, and the trees were thicker, limbs tangled like arms that didn't want to let go. It was quieter, too, in a way that pressed in on her chest. No birds, no streams, just the sound of her boots crunching through snow and mud. Hours passed. The light began to fade, and just as she started to wonder if she'd turned around without knowing it, she saw something between the trees. Stone, tall, cracked, covered in moss and ivy, hidden behind a curtain of branches. It wasn't a ruin. It was a gate. Not like a village gate or a wall. This was different. It stood alone, freestanding, and though it had no door, Mira felt it humming. She stepped closer. Symbols were carved into the arch, barely visible beneath the growth. Spirals, crescents, names, and something else. A word she hadn't seen before. Just one. Aaron. She said it aloud. The air around her shimmered. The ground beneath her boots trembled. And for the briefest moment, she thought she heard Daniel's voice. Not at her ear, but from beyond. Calling. Asterisk Mira. Asterisk. Then silence. The wind picked up. Snowflakes swirled through the trees, dancing in slow, deliberate spirals. She stepped back from the gate, her heart hammering. Asterisk, don't forget the next one. Asterisk, maybe this was it. Or maybe the next one hadn't come yet. But the door was open, and somewhere, someone was already walking toward it. Mira stood before the stone gate, the ancient word still echoing softly in her chest. The forest around her was still, but not lifeless. It felt like it was watching, curious, patient. She stepped forward slowly and touched the surface of the arch, feeling the rough texture beneath her fingers. The moss pulled away easily, revealing more symbols hidden beneath, all familiar now. Spirals, crescents, small words carved in the old language. She couldn't read them all, but one stood out, clear and deliberate, Eloan's name, right at the base. She closed her eyes. For a moment, there was nothing but wind, then warmth. It wasn't coming from the sun or the air. It came from within, a quiet sense that the worst had passed, that the danger was not in this place, but in forgetting it. This gate, this lonely structure tucked deep in the woods, wasn't meant to be crossed. It was meant to be remembered, marked, a warning and a promise. Mira didn't go further. She didn't need to. Her journey wasn't about walking into mystery. It was about understanding that some doors are meant to remain closed until the time is right, and that it's not bravery to open them, but wisdom to guard them. She stayed a while longer, just watching the forest breathe. The snow fell gently now, no longer heavy with silence. Birds had returned. The wind was clean. Something had shifted. Back in Eldom, the air carried the scent of wood smoke and damp soil. The village had slowly returned to its rhythm. People still lit candles near their doors, still traced spirals into soft ground. But now they did it without fear. It was no longer about keeping darkness away. It was about keeping memory alive. That was how they honored what had happened. The tree, planted where the chapel had once stood, had not sprouted yet. But the soil had changed. It was softer, richer, and people came often, not to pray or weep, but to speak. They would sit near it and tell quiet stories. Simple ones, about old winters and shared bread, about love that had survived loss. Children left drawings in the dirt. Elders left carved stones. And always, at the end of each day, someone would say Eloan's name. Daniel never returned, not physically. But word came months later, through a letter wrapped in unfamiliar fabric and delivered by a traveler who didn't stay long. Mira opened it with trembling hands. He had made a home. Time hadn't passed the same for him, but he remembered everything. He was telling people, carefully, quietly, about what he had seen. About Eldom, about the frost, and the spiral, and the girl who had reminded him what it meant to remember. He didn't know if anyone believed him, but he was planting seeds too. The letter ended with a single sentence. Asterisk, tell the tree, I haven't forgotten. Asterisk. Mira folded it carefully and placed it under the roots. Spring came, for real this time. Wildflowers pushed up near the edges of the forest. The river ran clear and fast. Children played in open fields again. And while the world outside Eldom still spun in its own way, the village remained a quiet place. Stronger now, wiser. Not because the cold had been beaten, but because they'd learned how to face it together. Mira kept writing. The journal that once held only warnings and memories now grew full with the daily lives of people who were learning how to hold both joy and sorrow in the same hands. She documented the carvings from the cellar, the gate in the forest, the messages left by Eloan, and every so often she added a new name. Someone who had lived, someone who mattered. She never went back to the gate, but sometimes when the wind shifted, she could feel something stir near its edge. Not a threat, just a presence, a quiet reminder that there was still more out there, that the world held layers not even the oldest books could explain. But that wasn't a reason to fear. It was a reason to keep remembering, because stories she had learned are the threads that hold time together. And forgetting them doesn't just weaken the past. It invites it to return, broken and misunderstood. One morning, years later, the tree finally broke through the soil. Just a sprout at first, delicate and green. But it grew fast, stronger than anyone expected. Its roots stretched deep, and its leaves shimmered in the light like they carried pieces of the sky. People said they could feel peace beneath it. Others said they dreamed clearer when they rested near it. And in the hollow space where the chapel once stood, birds began to nest. That, Mira thought, was the truest sign of healing. She stood near the tree one evening, her hands resting on its bark. It was old enough now to cast shadows, strong enough to lean on. She looked out over Eldom, quiet and golden in the fading light, and felt something in her chest settle. Not all wounds leave scars. Some become roots. And from those roots, if we tend them with care, something beautiful can grow. In the end, the coldest nights had taught them the warmest truths, that remembrance is protection, that community is power, and that even the quietest voices, when carried with love, can echo far beyond the winter. And somewhere beyond the forest, beyond the veil of time, someone else was listening, waiting, remembering. The story was finished, but the memory would live on.